chains snapped like brittle bones as 53 shackled Africans rose against their captors in the ship's belly, transforming from cargo into warriors in a single, explosive moment. The schooner La Amistad rocked violently off the Cuban coast as machetes found their mark, painting the deck crimson under a July moon in 1839. This uprising would ignite a legal battle that questioned the very foundation of human bondage in America. The revolt began at 2 a.m. when Sengbe Pieh, later known as Joseph Cinqué, slipped his iron restraints using a loose nail he'd worked at for days. The sound of grinding metal against metal had become the ship's lullaby, masked by creaking timber and Atlantic swells. Captain Ramon Ferrer slept in his cabin, dreaming of Havana profits, while death crept across his deck on bare feet. Cinqué moved like shadow through the hold, freeing others with practiced silence. These weren't American-born slaves accepting their fate, but recent captives from Sierra Leone who still remembered freedom's taste. Grabbing cane knives from the cargo hold, they surged upward into moonlight that revealed their captors' shocked faces. The crew fought back with desperate brutality, but 53 against 4 creates mathematics even courage can't overcome. Captain Ferrer fell first, a blade opening his throat before he could cry for help. The cook, Celestino, tried to hide behind water barrels, but found no sanctuary from justice delayed too long. What happens when the enslaved become the enslavers? 2 Spanish plantation owners, Jose Ruiz and Pedro Montes, cowered as Cinqué approached with blood-slick steel, knowing their purchased property had become their judges. They begged for mercy in Spanish, while their former cargo decided their fate in Mende, a language that had never learned the word for submission. By dawn, the Africans controlled the ship, but controlling a vessel and navigating one proved vastly different skills. They ordered the surviving Spaniards to sail east toward Africa, but Montes and Ruiz had other plans brewing in the darkness of each night's deception. The morning sun revealed bodies wrapped in canvas, ready for the sea's embrace. 2 crew members and the captain would never see Havana's harbor again, their dreams of slave trade profits sinking beneath Caribbean waves. Before we dive deeper into this story of rebellion and justice, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about justice in America. The Amistad began a zigzag journey across the Atlantic, sailing east by day toward African shores, then west by night as the Spanish survivors secretly changed course. For 63 days, this deadly game of navigation played out on waters that had carried millions into bondage. But the Africans were about to discover that winning their freedom at sea was only the beginning of a battle that would rage in American courtrooms, where their very humanity would stand trial. The compass needle swung wildly as Montes whispered coordinates to Ruiz in the darkness, their conspiracy unfolding beneath stars that had witnessed countless such betrayals. Each night brought the Amistad closer to American shores instead of African freedom, while the Africans slept, believing they sailed toward home. This navigation deception would deliver them into the hands of a legal system that viewed them as property, not people. Cinqué suspected treachery, but lacked the maritime knowledge to prove it. The sun rose in the wrong direction too often, and unfamiliar coastlines appeared where none should exist. When he confronted Montes with a cane knife pressed against the Spaniard's throat, the plantation owner swore by his Christian God that they sailed toward Africa, his lies smooth as Cuban rum. The Africans rationed water with military precision, believing their ordeal would end in weeks, not months. Children among them grew weaker as supplies dwindled, their mothers singing Mende lullabies that spoke of rivers they might never see again. The eldest captive, a man named Grabo, carved marks into the ship's rail to count passing days, each notch a prayer for landfall. From Montes's recovered diary, August 15, 1839. The blacks grow suspicious of our course. God help us if they discover our deception before we reach American waters. Meanwhile, the ship's stores ran dangerously low. The Africans had never planned for a 2-month voyage, expecting to reach Sierra Leone within weeks. They caught rainwater in torn sails and rationed hardtack with mathematical precision. But mathematics couldn't create food from nothing. Could you maintain hope while watching children starve around you? The Amistad had become a floating tomb where dreams of freedom rotted like the ship's hull. Dead calm days stretched into weeks, the vessel barely moving while supplies evaporated under a merciless Caribbean Sunday. Some Africans whispered that the spirits of their homeland were angry, punishing them for the violence they'd unleashed. But Cinqué refused despair, organizing fishing expeditions and rain collection with the same tactical brilliance he'd used to plan the revolt. His leadership kept 53 people alive on a ship designed to kill them slowly, transforming cargo holds into communities bound by shared struggle. On August 24th, a sail appeared on the horizon, growing larger with each passing hour. The USS Washington, a revenue cutter on patrol, approached with cannons visible and intentions unclear. The Africans faced an impossible choice: fight another battle they couldn't win, or surrender to a nation that had perfected the art of human bondage. The revenue cutter's cannons gleamed in the afternoon sun as Lieutenant Thomas Gedney boarded the mysterious schooner, finding 53 half-starved Africans and 2 terrified Spaniards in a scene that defied easy explanation. The deck still bore dark stains that spoke of violence, while the smell of death and desperation hung thick in the salt air. This moment would transform a slave revolt into America's most controversial legal case. Gedney surveyed the chaos with a naval officer's eye for detail. Broken shackles littered the hold like discarded jewelry, while cane knives lay scattered across sun-bleached planks. The Africans watched him warily, uncertain whether this uniformed stranger represented salvation or another form of bondage. Montez rushed forward, speaking rapid Spanish, punctuated by desperate gestures toward Cinqué and his followers. Through broken English, he painted them as murderous slaves who had killed their rightful masters, demanding protection under Spanish law and American maritime authority. But Cinqué stepped forward with regal bearing, his scarred hands speaking a different truth in gestures that needed no translation. This man carried himself like a king, not cargo. The USS Washington had stumbled upon legal dynamite, disguised as a routine patrol. Were these African slaves who had committed murder, or free men defending themselves against kidnappers? The answer would depend on which nation's laws applied, and whether dark-skinned people possessed rights that white courts were bound to respect. Gedney made a decision that would echo through American courtrooms for years. Rather than determining the Africans' fate at sea, he ordered the Amistad escorted to New London, Connecticut, where federal judges could untangle the jurisdictional nightmare blooming like algae in his wake. Property or people? The journey north took 3 days, during which the Africans experienced their first taste of American justice. They were fed regular meals and allowed to move freely about the deck, but iron manacles remained locked around their wrists. Kindness wrapped in chains created its own form of torment. Local newspapers had already caught wind of the story by the time the ships reached Connecticut waters. Reporters rode out to meet them, sketching dramatic scenes of noble savages and civilized captors for readers who would consume their breakfast alongside accounts of maritime murder. From the New London Gazette, August 27, 1839. The African mutineers present a spectacle both terrible and pitiable, their countenances bearing the stamp of untamed ferocity, mixed with the dejection of captives. The Africans were marched through New London streets like exotic animals, drawing crowds who had never seen slavery's victims transformed into its agents. Some spectators cheered their courage, others called for immediate execution, but most simply stared in fascination at people who had dared to break their chains. What would you have done? Watching from those sidewalks, as freedom walked past in shackles. The New Haven County Jail became their temporary home, its stone walls echoing with languages that had never heard the Constitution read aloud. Cinqué and his followers faced a legal system that had never seriously considered whether kidnapped Africans possessed the same right to self-defense as white men. But unknown to the prisoners, their case had already attracted the attention of abolitionists who saw opportunity gleaming like gold in Connecticut courtrooms. Stone walls echoed with Mende prayers as news of the Amistad captives spread through anti-slavery networks like wildfire across dry grass. Lewis Tappan, a wealthy New York merchant turned abolitionist, read the newspaper accounts with calculating eyes that saw legal opportunity wrapped in human suffering. This case could shatter the moral foundations of American slavery if the right arguments reached the right ears. Tappan moved with businessman efficiency, organizing what would become the Amistad Committee within days of the Africans' imprisonment. He understood that public opinion battles required both money and media, marshaling resources with the same precision he'd once used to build his silk importing empire. The committee's first challenge was communication. How do you mount a legal defense when your clients speak no English and you speak no Mende? Tappan hired Professor Josiah Gibbs from Yale College, a linguist who walked New York's docks, repeating Mende numbers until he found African sailors who could translate. The breakthrough came when James Covey, a former slave-turned-interpreter, arrived at New Haven County Jail. For the first time since their capture in Africa, Cinqué and his followers could tell their story in words that American courts might understand. From Covey's translation notes, September 5, 1839. Cinqué says they were free men in their homeland, stolen by Portuguese traders and sold illegally in Havana. They killed only to defend themselves from kidnappers. But telling their story and proving it in court were different challenges entirely. The Africans faced a legal system designed to protect property rights, not human rights, where precedent favored owners over the owned. Meanwhile, Spanish authorities demanded the Amistad captives be returned as stolen property under existing treaties. Queen Isabella's government viewed the case as simple piracy, not justified rebellion, threatening diplomatic consequences if America failed to honor international agreements. Whose laws would determine their fate? The abolitionists faced their own internal struggles. Some wanted to focus purely on legal arguments about the Africans' free status, while others saw opportunity to challenge slavery's entire legal foundation. Tappan walked a careful line between pragmatic legal strategy and revolutionary moral crusade. Public opinion swayed like weather vanes in political winds. Northern newspapers portrayed the Africans as noble freedom fighters, while Southern publications painted them as murderous savages who threatened civilization itself. The case became a Rorschach test for American attitudes about race, freedom, and the price of property rights. The Africans themselves remained largely unaware of the legal and political storm swirling around their fate. They spent their days in jail learning English words and American customs, preparing for trials they barely understood in a language that had no equivalent for their concept of ancestral freedom. What would you believe about justice if you were caged for defending yourself? District Attorney William Holabird received direct pressure from President Martin Van Buren's administration to resolve the case quickly and quietly. The 1840 presidential election loomed, and Van Buren needed Southern votes more than he needed Northern moral approval. But the abolitionists had no intention of allowing quiet resolution, transforming the Amistad defendants from anonymous captives into celebrities whose faces appeared on pamphlets and posters across New England. Section 5. The trial begins. Gavel strikes echoed through Hartford's federal courthouse as Judge Andrew Judson called the most controversial case of his career to order, while outside crowds pressed against windows to glimpse the Africans who had dared to break their chains. The courtroom's mahogany panels and brass fixtures spoke of established order, but the men in the defendant's dock represented chaos unleashed upon America's carefully constructed racial hierarchy. This trial would determine whether the Constitution's promises extended to people stolen from distant shores. Roger Baldwin, the Africans' lead attorney, faced an impossible task: convincing a white jury that black men possessed the same natural rights as their captors. At 35, Baldwin had built his reputation defending unpopular causes, but never had the stakes felt so personally and nationally explosive. The prosecution's strategy was elegantly simple. District Attorney Holabird argued that regardless of the Africans' original status, they had become Spanish property through legal purchase in Havana's slave markets. Under international law and existing treaties, they must be returned to their rightful owners or face murder charges for killing Captain Ferrer. Cinqué sat in the defendant's chair with quiet dignity, his translator James Covey whispering explanations of proceedings that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. The African leader watched white men debate his humanity using legal precedents that had never contemplated his existence. From court transcripts, January 8, 1840, the defendant Cinqué states through his interpreter that he killed only to protect himself and his people from those who would sell them into lifelong bondage. Baldwin's counter-strategy required proving two interconnected claims. First, that the Africans were free men illegally kidnapped, and second, that they possessed inherent rights to self-defense regardless of their legal status. Both arguments challenged fundamental assumptions about race and property that American law had never seriously questioned. The courtroom became theater, where competing visions of American justice played out before packed audiences. Northern spectators cheered when Baldwin presented evidence of the Africans' illegal capture, while Southern observers muttered about dangerous precedents that could destabilize their entire economic system. Could 12 white men see humanity in faces trained to be invisible? Key testimony came from Dr. Richard Madden, a British expert on West African slave trading who had witnessed the illegal Portuguese operations that captured Cinqué and his followers. His clinical descriptions of kidnapping methods and forged documents provided legal framework for Baldwin's humanitarian arguments, but the prosecution struck back with Spanish law and commercial precedent, arguing that whatever the Africans' original status, they had been legally transformed into property through established market transactions. Their subsequent violence represented theft and murder, not justified self-defense. The Africans themselves remained largely silent observers of their own fate, understanding enough English to grasp the stakes, but unable to fully participate in legal proceedings that would determine whether they lived or died. They watched white men debate questions that seemed obvious to anyone who had experienced chains around their wrists. Death or freedom, balanced on legal technicalities. Judge Judson faced pressure from multiple directions. The Van Buren administration wanted quick resolution, favoring Spanish claims, while abolitionists demanded justice that recognized African humanity. His decision would either reinforce slavery's legal foundations or crack them wide enough for future challenges to slip through. As January snow fell outside Hartford's courthouse windows, closing arguments approached with the weight of history pressing down on everyone present. The jury's footsteps echoed like drumbeats as they filed back into the Hartford courtroom after 3 days of deliberation, their faces revealing nothing, while Cinqué and his followers awaited a verdict that would determine whether they lived as free men or died as property. Judge Judson's gavel commanded silence in a room where every breath carried the weight of precedent, about to be shattered or reinforced. This moment would redefine the boundaries of American justice and human dignity. Foreman Samuel Rossiter stood with paper trembling in his weathered hands, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his words. We find that these Africans were born free and of right ought to be free and not slaves. The courtroom erupted as abolitionists cheered and Spanish representatives sat stunned by a verdict that challenged the very free foundations of international slave trading. Judge Judson's ruling went further than anyone expected, declaring that the Africans must be released immediately and provided passage back to their homeland at government expense. His legal reasoning was precise. Individuals illegally kidnapped could not become legitimate property through subsequent sale, regardless of where those transactions occurred. The decision sent shockwaves through both diplomatic and economic circles. Spanish Minister Ángel Calderón de la Barca immediately filed protests with Secretary of State John Forsyth, threatening to damage American-Spanish relations over what Madrid viewed as theft of legally purchased property. Southern newspapers denounced the verdict as Northern aggression disguised as legal principle, warning that such precedents would encourage slave revolts throughout the region. The Charleston Mercury declared, "This decision strikes at the heart of our social order and invites chaos into well-regulated communities." But had justice truly been served? President Van Buren faced an impossible political calculation as the 1840 election approached. Supporting the verdict would cost him Southern votes essential for re-election, while overturning it would energize Northern abolitionists against his candidacy. His solution was characteristically cautious. Federal prosecutors would appeal to the Supreme Court. The Africans celebrated their legal victory with songs that echoed through New Haven's jail walls, but they remained imprisoned while appeals wound through higher courts. Freedom declared was not freedom granted, especially when powerful interests demanded different outcomes. Lewis Tappan and the Amistad Committee recognized that their battle had only reached its halfway point. The Supreme Court, dominated by Southern justices appointed by slave-owning presidents, presented even greater challenges than Connecticut's federal court. From Tappan's correspondence, March 15, 1840, "We have won the battle, but not yet the war. The highest court in the land must now decide whether justice has color boundaries." Meanwhile, the Africans continued learning English and American customs, preparing for what might be their final legal confrontation. Cinqué studied law books with the same intensity he had once applied to planning revolt, understanding that words could prove more powerful than weapons. The Supreme Court's marble columns would soon witness arguments that questioned America's commitment to the principles it claimed to cherish. Their fate now rested with 9 men who had never worn shackles, but would decide the future of those who had broken them through courage and desperate necessity. Section 7. Before the Supreme Court, marble columns towered like ancient sentries as the Supreme Court convened on February 22, 1841, to hear arguments that would determine whether America's highest legal principles applied to men whose skin marked them as property in half the nation. The chamber's gilt ceiling and red velvet drapes spoke of established power, while in the gallery sat Africans whose very presence challenged every assumption about who deserved constitutional protection. This case would test whether American justice was truly blind or simply selective in its vision. Former President John Quincy Adams, now 73 and serving in Congress, had agreed to argue the Africans' case despite political risks that could tarnish his distinguished career. His decision puzzled Washington insiders, who wondered why the ex-president would stake his reputation on defending men most Americans viewed as dangerous criminals. Attorney General Henry Gilpin represented the Van Buren administration's position with clinical precision, arguing that international treaties required returning the Africans to Spanish custody, regardless of their original legal status. His case relied on diplomatic necessity rather than moral principle, claiming that America's word in international agreements mattered more than individual liberty. The 9 justices listened, with faces carved from judicial stone, their expressions revealing nothing, while competing visions of American law played out before them. Chief Justice Roger Taney, author of the future Dred Scott decision, held particular power to shape outcomes that could either expand or contract constitutional protections. Adams rose to speak with the weight of revolutionary history in his voice, reminding the court that America itself had been born from violent resistance to unjust authority. His argument was dangerous in its implications. If the Africans lacked the right to violent self-defense, then the American Revolution itself stood on questionable moral ground. From Adams's Supreme Court argument, March 1st, 1841. The moment you come to the Declaration of Independence, that every man has a right to life and liberty, an inalienable right, this case is decided. But legal precedent weighed heavily against such expansive interpretations. Decades of court decisions had consistently treated enslaved people as property, not persons, creating jurisprudential momentum that required extraordinary justification to reverse. Could 9 white men extend constitutional promises to faces they had been taught not to see as fully human? The Africans themselves waited in New Haven, following newspaper accounts of proceedings they could barely comprehend. Cinqué had learned enough English to understand that powerful men were debating whether his life possessed legal value, a conversation that would have seemed absurd in the village where he was born free. Justice Joseph Story, considered the court's leading legal scholar, posed questions that suggested sympathy for the African's plight while remaining constrained by existing law. His inquiries about natural rights versus positive law revealed the philosophical tensions at the case's heart. The administration's political calculations grew more desperate as arguments progressed. Van Buren had already lost the 1840 election to William Henry Harrison, partly due to Northern anger over his Amistad policies, but federal prosecutors continued pursuing appeals that might deliver the Africans to Spanish authorities. Justice hung in constitutional balance. As arguments concluded, Adams delivered a peroration that transformed legal proceeding into moral crusade, invoking revolutionary principles that had been dormant in American law for decades. His words echoed through chambers where the Founding Fathers' promises would either expand or contract based on 9 men's interpretation of what equality meant. The court retired to deliberate while the nation held its breath, knowing that their decision would reverberate far beyond the fate of 53 Africans who had dared to break their chains on the high seas. The Supreme Court's decision arrived like thunder on March 9, 1841, as Justice Joseph Story delivered the majority opinion that would either vindicate or condemn 53 Africans who had fought for freedom on the Atlantic's blood-stained waters. His voice carried across the marble chamber, where constitutional principles faced their most severe test since the nation's founding. This verdict would determine whether America's promises belonged to all humanity or remained reserved for those deemed worthy by law. Story's words cut through decades of legal precedent with surgical precision. These Africans never were the lawful slaves of Ruiz or Montez or of any other Spanish subjects. They are natives of Africa and were kidnapped there and were unlawfully transported to Cuba in violation of the laws and treaties of Spain. The decision was sweeping in scope, declaring not only that the Africans must be freed immediately, but that the federal government bore responsibility for returning them to their homeland. 7 justices supported the majority opinion, with only one dissent from Justice Henry Baldwin on narrow procedural grounds. Chief Justice Taney, despite his later infamy in the Dred Scott case, joined the majority in recognizing the Africans' right to violent self-defense against illegal kidnapping. The irony would echo through legal history as the same court that would later deny citizenship to all African Americans temporarily acknowledged their fundamental human rights. From Justice Story's opinion, if these persons were kidnapped and are by the laws of Spain entitled to their freedom, then the treaties with Spain cannot deprive them of that freedom. The courtroom erupted as abolitionists realized they had achieved the impossible. America's highest court had declared that some black lives possessed legal value equal to white property interests. Spanish representatives sat stunned, while the Africans themselves, listening through translators, began to comprehend that their long legal nightmare was ending. But victory in law was not victory in practice. The Van Buren administration, though defeated at every legal level, maintained control over the Africans' physical custody until the Supreme Court's mandate was formally executed. Bureaucratic delays stretched days into weeks as federal marshals processed release orders that some officials hoped might be reversed through political intervention. Meanwhile, Southern politicians denounced the decision as judicial tyranny that encouraged slave rebellion throughout their region. Senator John C. Calhoun declared the verdict a dangerous precedent that strikes at the very foundation of our social institutions. The Africans spent their final weeks in American custody, learning skills they would need for their return journey. Basic navigation, English phrases for communicating with ship captains, and American currency concepts for purchasing supplies during their voyage home. What would freedom feel like after 2 years of fighting for the right to breathe it? On November 27, 1841, 35 surviving Africans boarded the ship Gentleman in New York Harbor, bound for Sierra Leone with funds raised by the Amistad Committee. 18 had died during their long imprisonment. Victims of American diseases, their bodies couldn't fight, while their spirits battled for legal recognition. Cinqué stood at the ship's rail as Manhattan's skyline faded into memory, carrying with him knowledge of American justice that few Africans would ever possess. He had seen the nation's highest court declare his humanity legally valid, even as its streets remained filled with enslaved people who possessed no such protection. The Amistad case ended where it began, with Africans crossing the Atlantic toward uncertain futures, but this time they sailed as free men, whose courage had cracked slavery's legal foundations wide enough for future generations to slip through. Even today, some say Cinqué's spirit still walks the waters off Sierra Leone, watching for ships that carry cargo they shouldn't, reminding the ocean that some chains were meant to be broken. The Gentleman disappeared beyond the horizon on December 3, 1841, carrying 35 freed Africans toward Sierra Leone, while their legal victory rippled through American society like stones cast in still water. Their successful rebellion had accomplished what decades of abolitionist arguments could not, forcing America's highest court to declare that some black lives possessed inherent rights that law must recognize. This precedent would inspire future freedom fighters while terrifying those who profited from human bondage. The Amistad decision became legal ammunition for anti-slavery lawyers challenging the system's foundations in courtrooms across the North. Cases citing Cinqué's victory appeared in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York, each one chipping away at slavery's legal edifice with arguments about natural rights and constitutional principles. Southern states responded with increasingly restrictive slave codes designed to prevent future revolts. The specter of organized resistance haunted plantation owners, who now saw potential rebels in every kitchen servant and field hand. Ships carrying enslaved people installed additional security measures, creating floating prisons that acknowledged the possibility of organized uprising. Frederick Douglass wrote extensively about the case's significance, viewing the Africans' legal triumph as proof that slavery could not withstand sustained moral and legal pressure. His speeches frequently invoked Cinqué's courage as evidence that freedom was worth any risk, any sacrifice. From Douglass's autobiography, the Amistad case proved that even America's highest court could not forever ignore the crying contradictions between its founding principles and its daily practices. The case also revealed deep fissures within American society that would eventually tear the nation apart. Northern celebration of the verdict contrasted sharply with Southern fury over judicial interference in property rights, the preview of the constitutional crisis that would explode into civil war 20 years later. But what became of the individual Africans who sailed home? Historical records from Sierra Leone suggest that many Amistad survivors struggled to reintegrate into societies they had left as young adults. 2 years in American prisons had changed them, exposing them to Christianity, Western education, and legal concepts that didn't translate easily to traditional African communities. Cinqué himself established a small trading post near Freetown, using English language skills and American connections developed during his imprisonment. Some accounts suggest he continued corresponding with Lewis Tappan and other abolitionists, providing intelligence about illegal slave trading operations along the West African coast. 3 survivors chose to remain in America, settling in Connecticut communities where they had learned English and adopted Christian faith. Their decision puzzled many observers who couldn't understand why anyone would choose to stay in a nation that had imprisoned them for defending their freedom. The Amistad schooner itself met a mundane fate, sold at auction to settle legal debts, and eventually wrecked in Caribbean waters. Its revolutionary cargo replaced by ordinary merchandise that generated no headlines or constitutional crises. Legal scholars still debate the decision's long-term impact on American jurisprudence. Some view it as an isolated humanitarian gesture that did little to challenge slavery's fundamental legitimacy, while others see it as crucial precedent that helped prepare legal groundwork for emancipation. The truth, as always, was more complex than either interpretation suggested. Modern DNA analysis of artifacts from the original Amistad case has revealed connections between the African captives and specific ethnic groups in present-day Sierra Leone, confirming their testimony about illegal kidnapping and providing scientific validation for legal arguments made 180 years ago. But perhaps the case's greatest legacy lies not in legal precedent, but in moral example. 53 people who refused to accept that their humanity was negotiable, who fought for freedom with weapons and words until America's highest court was forced to recognize what they had always known about themselves. Their courage crossed an ocean twice and changed a nation's understanding of who deserved constitutional protection. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.